Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another interview. My name is Leah Eichler, and today I have the distinct honor of interviewing Max Gross, the author of The Lost Shtetl. Max Gross is a New Yorker. He's worked for The Forward, the New York Post. He's an award-winning author, and I'm just so pleased to have you here, Max.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
So for those of you who have not read The Lost Shtetl, I'll give you the Coles Notes version. The Coles Notes is a Canadian thing, I think. And it's a shtetl in Poland that has essentially been untouched. In other words, no one has found the shtetl for 100 years. Is stumbled upon in modern times and is brought in sometimes violently into the 21st century. And it is such a brilliant concept, if I can say that, Max. It's just a brilliant concept for a novel.
Please.
And so tell us a little bit, if you can. I mean, did you have an original inspiration for the book?
Well, I would say, when people ask me this question, I always say that there's like a micro and a macro
Mhm.
story behind it, which was so I had the micro, the most immediate story behind that was I had been reading a book called The War Against the Jews by
Mhm.
Lucy Dimitrich, which was
Right,
just
right.
about the Holocaust.
Mhm.
And there was just one of the things about it, which I found very interesting, was it was very heavy with data. There was a
Mhm.
lot of data in it, and one of the things that I just remember reading, like or thinking upon reading it, was she goes through the statistics of people in various provinces and countries and all this stuff, and I just remember thinking, my God, wasn't there were so many settlements, strewn throughout Eastern Europe. Didn't one of them have like a bad map, like, attached to it? And I just remember like a light bulb going off and thinking, whoa, well, if one did, that would be a very interesting story.
Right.
Um, so that was where the initial, like, flame for the story came from. But, you mentioned the forward.
Right.
I started my, career in journalism there. And I remember once doing a story about New Square, New York, which is
Mhm.
this very rural town in upstate New York. That's, I believe, they're Skver Hasids. And the story was about, like, apparently this carp at a fish market suddenly raised its head and started speaking in Yiddish, claiming that it was the departed soul of this, Hasid who lived in the town. And when I heard this story secondhand, I went straight up to New Square, New York. And when I was out there, I remember getting off the bus, and this was, a long time ago. It was before, cell phones and GPS and all this other stuff. Um, and as I got off the bus, I saw this flock of sheep pass in front of me. And I just remember having this thought, like, my God, I've landed in Poland. I've stopped in Poland, and it was, I guess, 2006 or 2005 or something like that. And I remember that being a very profound thought for me, like,
Mhm.
that so many Jews, like so many of these, like, Hasidic communities in Brooklyn or in wherever are very isolated.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
and that was something that stayed with me for a really long time.
Mhm. I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, what I think really resonated for me about the story is it's probably very much like your initial impulse. There is this, yes, deep-seated desire that there is some like untouched village somewhere. And
Mhm.
through some archaeological digging, or excavation, you're gonna find, this civilization. Because what fascinates me, and I've written a lot about Holocaust fiction and post-Holocaust literature, is um, there is this idea of, we can't really capture, we can talk about the tragedy, but we actually can't really capture what was lost. And I think
Mhm.
you really capture what was lost in a very interesting way is this civilization that no longer exists. I mean, does that resonate with you?
Well, I'm very gratified to hear that.
Yeah,
Obviously that's the intention.
right.
And I think that, I mean, I think that those bridges to the old world
Hmm.
are very romantic for a lot of people.
Right.
There is like, that desire to that these civilizations persist.
Hmm.
I used to describe it is like an almost like an Amazonian tribe of Jews in the middle of like, the middle of the wilderness.
So true.
Um, and when you hear those stories about like,
Hmm.
these civilizations that are untouched by the West, by other civilizations, I think it's always gives you a sense of like, what was lost, which I think,
Hmm.
you're very right about. But also, uncharted possibilities, what could have been.
Hmm.
And I think that's part of the reason why some of those stories are very attractive. And the other way I described the book for a long, long time was it was a Yiddish Brigadoon.
Right.
And that was always, I hadn't seen Brigadoon since I was a kid, and I actually, once I got the idea for the book, I sort of avoided seeing it because I didn't want necessarily like, that kind of influence.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think that those like, sleepy, things that have just sort of been forgotten by time,
Hmm.
there's so much possibility with something
Hmm.
like that.
I mean, the interesting thing for me as well is, I mean, I can't imagine how much research you did for this book. It seemed, I mean, it was really well brought to life. I know you have a disclaimer in the afterword about, I'm sure someone may find a mistake, but I mean, it seemed very, very accurate to me, but also the humanity of the characters involved. I mean, even in a very small village. And I think there is this misguided idea, although maybe it's changing by people outside the Jewish community, that we're all very monolithic and we all kind of agree with each other. And really, even a very small village, like there are huge disagreements and huge divisions based on, religious levels, on socioeconomic levels, on political levels. And you really captured uh, that is that tension that I think Jews will relate to even today, right?
Well, I mean, I do think that that's the essence of quality fiction is
Mhm.
really trying to give your characters three dimensions. Like
Sure.
that nobody thinks, fully one way or the other is like,
Hmm.
really trying to shape individuals who have conflicting, feelings. And one of the things that I think was pleasurable about writing about like a town and
Hmm.
doing sort of a mosaic of different characters was that you could include a lot of characters who
Hmm.
have a lot of different like, perspectives on it, and
Hmm.
that was one of the things that I really enjoyed
Hmm.
when working on the book. And yes, I agree. It is, not a monolith
Hmm.
in terms of like, how people view this, strange encounter with modernity.
Right.
Um, and it's funny you said research. I just will say, the research. I'm one of these guys who I read my first Isaac Bashevis Singer story when I was
Hmm.
about 11 or 12 years old, and fell instantly, passionately um, uh, in love
Hmm.
with him and with Yiddish literature in general. So I spent, so much time, reading Yiddish stories, Shalom
Hmm.
Aleichem,
Hmm.
Shalom Ash, like
Hmm.
Bergelson, all these like, writers that I actually did a lot of the research after the fact.
Right.
I wrote the first draft of the book, and I almost started filling in the gaps afterwards, going,
Hmm.
just, I don't know whether that's too inside baseball or something like that, but
No,
just
it's
you
interesting.
mentioned the research, so I felt like I
Well,
should.
it just seemed very, I mean, it seemed very accurate, and I know it seemed very true to life, but that's just probably a testament to your writing skills. But um, it's funny you mentioned like Isaac Bashevis Singer and Shalom Aleichem, because there really is, I mean, again, there is the shtetl of our imagination, and that
Yeah.
shtetl really, and I mean, we don't know if that shtetl really existed the way our imagination thinks it existed in terms of, a Fiddler on the Roof type of shtetl?
Yeah.
Is there an Anna Tefka with absurd characters? Probably, because absurd characters exist everywhere, um, but also probably accurately, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
well, it's funny. I actually think that Anna Tekva even I've heard it like, described as like Jewish minstrelry, which I think
right,
is unfair. But in a way, we almost think back on it with like overly kind eye, like rose-colored glasses almost, because of like, if I were a rich man or something like that. The songs almost make it like sweeter than it actually is. But like if you remember, like one of they get driven out because of like, Cossacks, and they get like,
for
there's
sure.
all sorts of like, poverty and disaster and all these other things that happen in Anna Tekva. But um everybody's so nice about it. Like nobody has
Right.
like, like a secondary agenda that almost makes it sweeter than it actually is. But
Hmm.
Anna Tekva had its other issues. But it's funny. I do think that in Yiddish literature, there is a certain like level of realism
Hmm.
that sometimes doesn't that does get forgotten,
Hmm.
um, thanks to Fiddler on the Roof, which
Right.
was a great movie and I loved it. And I almost don't care about the um, accusations that it's like a minstrel show or something like
Hmm.
that for Jews. But in any event,
I,
we'll
I
get
listen, I mean, who doesn't love? I don't know. I'm sure there is that critique, but I'm a huge fan of Fiddler. So,
me too. Me too.
um, so it's interesting. So let's talk about, like it's, like the timing of the book. I mean, which is, I don't know. I think is very interesting because I wonder. I mean, a lot has obviously happened in the Jewish community in the last several months since October 7th.
Mm,
There's a lot of focus on Jewish literature, there's a lot of critique. There's maybe a romanticization going on about Jewish life, before October 7th or maybe before the Holocaust. I mean, I was hard not to read the book knowing about October 7th, largely
mm,
because the reaction of the inhabitants of the town to learning about the Holocaust was a bit kind of um, there was a mixture of like shock and disbelief.
mhm.
Um, I mean, do you think if like do you think you would have written it differently today? And do you think people reading it now will have a different perspective than people who read it before October 7th?
Well, that's an interesting question. I will say I don't know if I would have written it differently.
Hmm.
One of the things that I have thought a little bit about the book in the context of October 7th.
Hmm.
And one of the things that occurs to me, and it had occurred to me when I was writing the book, but I guess it had been one of many thoughts that I'd been thinking about in this, was that to a certain extent, the American Jewish experience or the Canadian Jewish experience is a lot like the people of Kreskel, in the sense that they were spared
Right.
from something very horrific and horrendous.
Hmm.
And I think that there was a sort of like warp speed, like awakening of like all the stuff that had happened that they didn't know about,
Hmm.
that's not similar to what the American Jews and the Canadian Jews have been thinking about, that they experienced it on a much longer timeline where a lot of things could seep in, and you know there could be all these other things. But the Jews of America were, like the Jews of Kreskel, spared.
Hmm.
And the the Jews of the Holocaust weren't.
Right.
And to a certain extent, that removal from the horror of the Holocaust, I do think that there's some parallels
Hmm.
between the experience of like what happened in October 7th. Of course, it's become it's been transported across the ocean, and it's become an incredibly, like, shockingly
Hmm.
uh, um, real issue for American Jews as well, because like, there are
Right.
these protests and there's these accusations, and there's this like, these hate crimes and all these other things that
Correct.
I certainly never experienced in my life before.
Right.
Um, but that also happens to the people of Creswell too.
Right.
So, I obviously I had no I don't claim to have any, prophetic powers,
Of course.
um, but one of the things, and that is one thing that I think is sort of interesting about anti-Semitism. It's very cyclical. It
Hmm.
goes through a lot of the same patterns again and
Hmm.
again. And I was observing the patterns of like, anti-Semitism in Europe versus, the versus America, and those were in my thoughts as well when I
Hmm.
was writing the book. And I think that there is probably something that can be gleaned from that, reading the book today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's actually really what hit me is the reaction of the inhabitants of Cresco. Um,
Mhm.
and you know, it was that kind of, but we've seen in pogroms before. So why is this different? And I
Yeah.
wonder if that if that philosophy or ideology is a bit infective in the Jewish community because, we're very quick. I mean, it's like we're very quick to draw comparisons between tragedies all the way up to like, the biblical Amalek, like that seems to be
Yeah.
like um, a very like Jewish community thing to do. Like, okay, well, this is just another example of X, Y, and Z. Um, I mean, it's interesting because I think it was so accurate, which is why the book was so powerful. Um, but I mean, do we learn anything from it? I mean, do we kind of try and, not make examples out of historical events such as October 7th or the Holocaust? Do we not try and recreate them? I don't know. Like there's something to be gleaned from it. I'm not quite sure what. I'm hoping you could provide answers, but I do feel like it's something that we as Jewish community tend to do is to kind of like draw on these historical comparisons. And I'm not sure that's always to our benefit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I certainly can't solve that, like, that equation.
Hmm.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
I don't fully know why anti-Semitism is so resilient,
Hmm.
and why it keeps cropping up in different forms. I
Hmm.
have my theories,
Yeah.
and one of my theories is that Jews represent, you know, it's really not about Jews. It's about, the
Hmm.
anti-Semitism, and that Jews represent, the ultimate Rorschach for them, like in the sense that, if you are a Marxist, then Jews are, capitalist swine. And if you're a capitalist, Jews are, filthy Marxists. And if you're, whatever you want to find, you can find in Jews, because Jews are very diverse in a lot of ways.
Correct. That's
Um,
actually it's really, really a great observation. Actually, I think that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And so, okay, so tell us a little bit about what you're working on now.
well, I'm actually working on a book that takes place in the Soviet Union during the
Okay.
1980s, if you can believe that.
Wow.
Uh,
Okay.
and unlike the last book, which took place, which was about like a shtetl world that was really, the research was like 100 years ago. This one much much closer in time to myself, and what an era that I lived through. I've been doing a tremendous amount of research for the book.
Yeah.
um, but this book, it's centered around Chernobyl, around the Chernobyl accident. There's
Hmm.
a very involved plot that goes along with it, which
Hmm.
I'm not going to spoil too much.
Good. Okay.
But I will say that I actually came up with the book, with the idea for the book, a good 4 years ago,
Hmm.
um, or three and a half at least. And I remember I was making plans, investigating flights and stuff like that for a trip to Kiev when the war broke out
Hmm.
between Ukraine and Russia. So
Hmm.
it actually really has nothing to do with that,
Right.
except for the fact that I am one of these people who does believe that Putin's regime is really, a continuation of the Soviet regime in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Um, there were some, economic reforms. There were some things that, are obviously different. Life in Russia today is not the same as life in, the Soviet Union in 1986, but there's a lot of continuity as well.
Hmm.
And autocratic factor of, what life was like under the Soviets, I think was unappreciated at
Hmm.
the time. I mean, like obviously everybody knew that there was a police state, and everybody knew that, there was a Politburo, but who was pulling the strings and stuff like that hasn't really changed. And that I
Right.
think is very interesting.
Oh, it sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to that. Okay, but before we sign off, tell us what do you have like favorite books that you're reading? Do you have favorite Jewish fiction? Do you have favorite Yiddish writers?
Well, I have so many favorite Jewish writers. I feel like picking among my children. I mean, look, I would have to say that my favorite, I do love Basheva Singer. I do think
Yeah.
that he's always one of my favorites. And I'll go one better and just say that one of my favorites that I don't know how much it's read, but I think is very good, is a book called Satan and Gore,
Uh-huh. Okay.
which had a great influence on one of the chapters, the history of the town,
Hmm.
which was about basically a false prophet, like a Sabbatai Zvi
Yeah.
who cropped up in I think it was the 16th century.
16th, yeah, I believe it's 16th century. That's right.
And like a whole town that gets infected with this, false messianism, which I thought
Hmm.
was a really wonderful book.
Hmm.
But there are so many. Uh,
Right. Okay. Well, are you reading what are you reading now?
well, right now I'm actually God, I'm reading so many Russia books. So this
Right.
this is the one, Robert Kaiser, Russia, the People and the Power, which I don't think is, I found that one in the Strand, but like
Mhm.
I'm reading all these books that are about Russia in the 1980s, so it's
Right.
all very, very boring.
Right.
I will say,
Uh,
no, I mean for me it's actually fascinating. So
I hope the author's not watching. Yeah.
well, no, I mean,
Mhm.
I'm sure that it's actually a wonderful book, but I just think
I'm
that
kidding.
it's a very specialized book because a lot of people would not really want to get that deep into, like, the flavor of what life is like in Moscow in
Hmm.
1986.
Hmm.
But for me, it's a real pleasure. Um, I was at a conference last week in Jerusalem
Hmm.
for the Sammy Rohr Literary Prize. I'm one of the fellows, and so that we had they invited us out to Jerusalem. And they asked us what was the best book we read in the last year, and I will say one that I feel, just based on our conversation, was one that I suggested, which was a book called Political Pilgrims by
Okay.
Paul Hollander, which was all about the Western experience of Stalinism, and
Hmm.
just how it had accepted all of this, like, brutality and mass murder, and apologized for it, and made up stories about it that
Hmm.
turned out to be, obviously very false. Um, it reminds me a lot of sort of the political situation now in
Hmm.
terms of Jews in Israel.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's one that I found, it really spoke to me when I read it.
Hmm. Okay, well, that's great. I'll add that to the list. All right. Well, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to speak with you. Again, Max Gross's The Lost Shtetl. I'm going to have a link to it in our post. And yeah, it will go down as one of my favorite books of the year that I read. So,
Leah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
all right. I'll speak to you soon. Thanks again.